will make sure that this Congress does not commit again the mistake of 2009. In 2009, the sense was, well, maybe we're getting there on economic recovery. We'll be able to come back later if maybe we didn't do enough. Well, we all know that a missed opportunity is a missed opportunity. And in 2009, the Congress said, all right, we can take our foot off the gas now. It was too early, and there wasn't any next effort to make up for the damage. I'm committed to making sure that doesn't happen again. And suffice it to say, in 2009, it took 7.5 years for the unemployment rate in Oregon to return to its pre-recession levels. This time around, the Congress has been warned. The warning I'm giving about making sure the Congress doesn't take its foot off the economic relief pedal too soon, it's not the first warning. Chair Powell, for example, made it clear that the biggest danger lies in not doing enough. Increasing relief checks to $2,000 is key. The Congress needs to increase and extend unemployment benefits for the entirety of the COVID crisis. And you do that by, in effect, tying the benefits to the real world, to economic conditions on the ground. And that's been my proposal for some time. Other colleagues have long advanced similar ideas. It is not a revolutionary proposition to say emergency relief should last as long as the emergency. Simply stated, and not be held up, not be held hostage by the arbitrary political agendas of members of Congress. If you don't do it, dysfunction and gridlock in Congress creates still more havoc for people who've done nothing wrong and just need help. A decade ago, that help went away too quickly because benefits expired arbitrarily and Congress did not keep up with extensions. The Congress needs to do better. And I believe that should include important upgrades as well to unemployment insurance, which was created in the last century. I don't think it's too much to say we at least bring a critical safety net program into the relevant century. Now, sometimes these programs look a little rusty in the modern economy. Sometimes it's because of outright sabotage. But workers suffer, particularly Black and Hispanic workers. And so there are steps that need to be taken in addition to modernizing the benefits, increasing base benefits, bringing all workers into the system, and ensuring it can hold up in a crisis. Finally, Chair Yellen had some important comments on fixing America's broken tax code. And I will tell you, Madam President, I start with the proposition that a nurse who's treating COVID patients and paying taxes with every single paycheck should not face themselves in a disadvantaged position when compared to billionaires who, in effect, do no such thing and can postpone and postpone and postpone paying their taxes. Now, there's a lot of work we need to do to repair the 2017 bill. The previous administration actually increased the incentive for corporations to ship jobs overseas. I want to fix that mistake. I want to work with Secretary Yellen on energy policy because so much of it deals with the tax code. And suffice it to say, those are just some of the challenges that Chair Yellen will face when I believe she is confirmed tonight as Treasury Secretary. Supremely qualified, a member, in my view, of the Senate Confirmation Hall of Fame, a proven economic policymaker, and finally, I say to my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, It is long past time to have a woman lead the U.S. Treasury Department. Chair Yellen's got my full support as colleagues come for this vote, and it's a significant economic policy vote. Make no mistake about that. I just ask colleagues to reflect on the fact that Chair Yellen was approved by the Finance Committee 26-0. Sometimes I say about this place, I have questions whether you can get a simple decision like ordering a sandwich decided on a 26-0. She was approved unanimously because she gives public service a good name. I urge my colleagues to support Janet Yellen for Secretary of Treasury when we vote in just a few minutes. Madam Chair, I yield the floor.
Senator from Kansas.
Madam President, thank you. I want to visit this evening on the Senate floor and take this opportunity to recognize a public servant, a leader, our former Secretary of the Army, the Honorable Ryan D. McCarthy. Secretary McCarthy led our nation's Army from September 30, 2019 to January 20, 2021. And during that time, he made it a more modern, agile, and lethal fighting force. We have worked together on a number of projects for Kansans and those who serve or have served on our nation during his tenure as Secretary, Acting Secretary, and Undersecretary of the Army, and I've grown to consider him a good, solid friend. One of my most memorable experiences in the Senate is visiting the 1st Infantry Division, soldiers in Germany and Poland, soldiers that come from Fort Riley, Kansas, with the Secretary, followed by our trip to Afghanistan to meet with troops on the front lines in the global war on terror. Those visits marked the beginning of our friendship, and since then I've appreciated his guidance and his support during his visits to Kansas and our many discussions here in the nation's capital. In 2019, Secretary McCarthy joined me in Kansas to visit Sites Elementary School, which serves families of the Big Red 1 soldiers and on Fort Riley. Secretary McCarthy was instrumental in helping to find funding for this school in 2011 when he was the Special Assistant to Defense Secretary Robert Gates, a Kansan. I was pleased he joined me in Kansas to visit the school and its students that he helped create in 2019. We also met with Fort Riley leadership and then traveled to Wichita to visit defense manufacturing and academic leaders to discuss the future of Army procurement. These personal touch points with soldiers and with the Army community were some of the reasons why Secretary McCarthy was universally respected within the Army family. While I will always appreciate our personal engagements with soldiers, I will also remember our efforts to support soldiers and veterans when they step off the battlefield or separate from military service. This past Veterans Day, we co-authored an editorial that discussed our parallel efforts to support the mental health and well-being of soldiers and veterans. Reports show Americans across the country are feeling isolated and alone in today's socially distanced environment, including our nation's servicemen and women and veteran populations. Between my efforts as chairman of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee to implement the Commander John Scott Hannon Veterans Mental Health Improvement Act and Secretary McCarthy's effort to build interpersonal connections between soldiers, we are working to give soldiers and veterans the tools they need to overcome mental health challenges they face. As Secretary McCarthy transitions out of the watchful eye of public life, I rise this evening to express my appreciation for his leadership, his character, and his moral compass. He never let politics or convenience influence his decisions, and that has significantly benefited soldiers, Army civilians, and veterans in Kansas and across the nation. As the chairman and now ranking member of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, I will always strive to help veterans find success after service. Secretary McCarthy, I have no doubt that you will find success and happiness after your dedicated service to our country. I wish you and your family, and I thank your family for their support of your public service, but I know that you and your family will find a quality life with purpose and meaning as you enter the next phase. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President,
Senator from Louisiana.
I ask unanimous consent to complete my remarks before the scheduled roll call vote.
Without objection.
Madam President, I rise today to recognize and thank 3 long-serving aides who have served my office, but more importantly, served our nation proudly, and they are now moving on to the next chapters of their life. First, Chris Gillott. Chris Gillott was my legislative director and for 8 years has been my right-hand person on policy. He never failed to take the ideas we discussed together and craft the actual policy needed to make a meaningful difference in the lives of folks in Louisiana and the lives of all Americans. He was a master at navigating the partisan divide to find areas of consensus upon which we could build to advance real solutions. And as always struck, he's on the first-name basis with the legislative director of and fill in the Democratic senator or the Republican senator's name. You had a sense that in the era before Zoom calls, they would go out and have a beer on a regular basis. And that helped us tremendously. We saw this fully on display recently, as Chris was a central figure in the so-called 908 coalition, which jump-started stalled COVID relief packages. And it wasn't just the relationships between the senators, but again, as I spoke, between the different legislative directors from both parties, all offices. His efforts have been central to passing legislation to ban surprise medical billing, a more than 2-year effort that will have a direct and positive impact on the pocketbooks of American families. He was crucial in our effort to make health care more affordable, pass generational tax reform. For every major legislative pursuit, I could rely upon Chris. But many in Louisiana may not know that he's also been a central figure engaged in some of the most pressing issues affecting our state, including offshore energy production, revenue sharing, energy regulation, permitting, the National Flood Insurance Program, and public works related to flood protection. All important to the well-being of our state, the folks who live there, as well as our entire country, and all these were regularly under assault. Chris was a fearless advocate for energy production and for the jobs that energy production creates to not only help meet America's energy needs, but to meet the individual family's financial needs. He has been on the front lines to prevent changes to revenue sharing that would gut the money used in my state for hurricane protection, flood mitigation, and coastal environmental renewal. He has defended the National Flood Insurance Program to ensure that this critical lifeline remains accessible to people across the country and importantly to those in Louisiana. Thank you, Chris, for all that you've done for me and for those of Louisiana. The next person I will speak of is Allison Capsner. Allison is a Minnesotan. She said she grew up on the upper end of the Mississippi, but she found a home in the lower end of the Mississippi, or at least the office that represented Louisiana. She joined my staff at the beginning of my first Senate term as a scheduler, but through sheer excellence became Deputy Chief of Staff and a close confidant. Trust is so important. I learned I could always trust Allie's judgment and her ability to accomplish anything. She is irreplaceable. She's had an impact on this office, ensuring that we better serve Louisiana, but that impact has meant that we will better serve Louisiana even after her departure. Well, examples. For any office to succeed, it needs to run efficiently and effectively. I knew this, that we had to have systems. Allie figured out the systems. She implemented them across all the offices here in D.C. and Louisiana. She kept things running smoothly. And she has a skill of identifying an individual's strength and helping that individual leverage those strengths into results that contributed to the whole, but also to the future of the individual. I'm about to say this about Allie, but I could say it of Chris and also of David, whom I'm about to speak of. Mark chapter 10, verses 42 through 45, Jesus speaks about servant leadership. In there is the quote, "The greatest among you shall be your servants." Allie is someone who served others and helped others serve as well. Whether it be our staff, our mission, our constituents, the state of Louisiana, or the United States of America, she served creatively and tirelessly. She will be greatly missed, but I am looking forward to all that she achieves as she enters the next phase of her career. Now let me speak of David Mills, a Louisiana native, a man of tremendous character and deep faith who served for 5 years on my staff. He came to Washington because he felt called to give back to his state and nation through public office, through public service. He was working in Congress for the right reasons, and his work reflected that. David handled pro-life issues and other legal issues for my office. He was key in last year's impeachment trial as an attorney, providing quick, reliable research to supplement my understanding of the testimony that we heard. David also has the ability just to note something others don't notice, and then very gently suggest some modification of how I would handle a situation. And that modification, although nuanced, could be so important. And I really learned to trust those insights. David also handled privacy issues, and he's laid the foundation for work that will continue after he has left us. As society becomes more technologically centered, we must ensure that data privacy laws keep up. David was on the forefront of that, thinking, how do we protect the privacy of consumers? As I mentioned, this will be an important issue in this upcoming Congress. And just let me be specific. David developed legislation on questions regarding the data that is collected from a wearable, a smartwatch, a contact tracing app, and other information that provides personal health information, but which is not covered by current personal health information laws. Our office will continue to build on David's work in those areas, and I thank David for all that he has done. Sometimes, Madam President, people say, oh my gosh, those folks who are younger than those of us in the Senate, is there something lacking? I can promise you among these, there is nothing lacking. They are the leaders that will take your place and my place as we pass the baton to the next generation. In turn, they shall pass to another to leave our future brighter than it has been in the past. And with that, Madam President, I yield.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Question is on the nomination. The yeas and nays are ordered. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Orono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Markowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Cantwell, Cardin, Cassidy, Crapo, Duckworth, Feinstein, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, Johnson, Kane, Kelly, Leahy, Menendez, Merkley, Moran, Padilla, Peters, Rosen, Schatz, Whitehouse, Wyden. Senators voting in the negative: Cotton, Hawley. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Marshall, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Ms. Lummis, aye. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Brown, aye. Ms. Sinema, aye. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mrs. Murray, aye. Mr. Romney, aye. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Carper, aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Warner, aye. Ms. Hassan, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Ossoff, aye. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Graham, aye. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Reed, aye. Mis- Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Langford, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Lujan, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Tuberville, no. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Sass, aye. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Daines, aye. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Shelby, no. Mrs. Blackburn, no. Mr. Cornyn, Aye. Mr. Warnock. Mr. Warnock, aye. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, aye. Ms. Smith. Ms. Smith, aye. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mrs. Capito, Mrs. Capito, aye. Ms. Barrasso, Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Lee, Mr. Lee, no.
It's not that, it's just I want you to know what we're gonna say, so he has the right.
Ms. Warren, Ms. Warren, aye. Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Kramer, no. Mr. McConnell, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Tillis, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida, no. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Haggerty, aye. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Braun, aye. Ms. Ernst, aye. Mr. Sullivan, no.
Does any senator wish to vote or change their vote? If not, the yeas are 84, the nays are 15, and the confirmation is confirmed. The nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table, and the President will be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
Madam President.
Senior Senator from Minnesota.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to legislative session and be in a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Madam President.
Junior Senator from Alaska.
Madam President, I want to be one of the first senators to congratulate Dr. Yellen, now Secretary Yellen, to be Secretary of the Treasury of the United States. You saw as a strong vote, and there's no doubt that she has the credentials, the experience, the qualifications to be Secretary of the Treasury. Former Chairman of the Fed. I mean, her resume is off the charts, and I know her nomination is historic for so many women across the country, including my 3 daughters. So, Madam President, I'm mentioning this because I certainly intended to vote for now Secretary Yellen, and I was a no vote. And I want to explain my no vote, because I had a very good conversation with her. Just the other day, we covered a whole bunch of topics. Everything from Alaska Native corporations to the strength of the dollar to our debt and deficit, big macroeconomic issues that are important to the country, particularly as we're in a recession, important to my state. But we got to the topic of energy. And reluctantly, I am saying this now because I was a bit shocked, that despite a long, robust discussion, it was very difficult to get her, from my perspective, to commit to being a Secretary of the Treasury, the most important economic player in any cabinet, in any government, in the U.S. government, besides, of course, the President, to commit to being a strong advocate for a robust, all-of-the-above energy sector for the U.S. economy. Now, Madam President, this is not a radical proposition. I would argue that every Secretary of the Treasury since Alexander Hamilton has been a robust supporter of resource development in our energy sector. Again, all of it, renewables, oil, gas. And the reason is because it's been such an important driver of economic growth and jobs for pretty much our entire nation's existence. And now that we're in this recession, deep recession, and we need job growth, good job growth, and we need a strong recovery, to me, having the Secretary of the Treasury be a strong proponent in the debates about policy for the energy sector, I thought was a no-brainer. As a matter of fact, I think pretty much every Secretary of the Treasury has been that person. And again, the 2008-2009 recession, the deep Great Recession, the #1 driver of economic growth and job growth and capital formation for the U.S. economy was the energy sector. And it was supported. Democrats and Republicans for decades have supported a strong energy sector. But despite a long, respectful debate with now Secretary Yellen, who I certainly want to have a good relationship with, could not get that commitment, which I thought was surprising. As a matter of fact, I thought it was shocking. And it's the reason I reluctantly voted no, because again, she is very qualified. Madam President, what's going on here is we're starting to see policies that I believe need a national debate. A national debate. We're starting to see policies. Yes, we all want renewables, clean energy, but we have a really important, strong energy sector. Prior to the pandemic, we were the world's superpower of energy again. One of the reasons we won World War II is because of our energy sector. And the men and women who have been producing energy, all of the above energy, are great patriotic workers who've been doing it for decades to the benefit of every single American. But we need a debate, because what I'm starting to see with the new administration, unfortunately, and I've had discussions, and hopefully they're not going to go down this path, is executive actions that are going to target certain sectors of the energy sector of the U.S. economy. Natural gas. We can be dominant in natural gas for 100 years. We're going to start targeting workers in the natural gas sector. Oil. I know some people don't like oil, but it's important. We can do all of this, but right now there seems to be hostility towards this sector and the workers and no debate. We should have that debate. It's an important debate. It's really important to my state, but I think it's really important to America. Every Secretary of the Treasury for the last 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 decades since World War II has always sought the goal of getting America back to energy independence. That's good for jobs. It's good for low-cost manufacturing. It's good to reduce the heating and energy bills of American families. It's good for our national security. It's good for our foreign policy. And we are pretty much on the verge of doing this. And now we're going to start to unilaterally disarm. We've gotten to the point where I can't find anyone, and I hope I'm wrong, in the Biden administration cabinet who's going to be a proponent of a strong energy sector. Who is it? I was hoping it was going to be the Secretary of the Treasury. Maybe in our long discussion I misinterpreted where she's going to be on this issue, but pretty much every previous secretary, Democrat, Republican, in the history of our great nation has really, really been an advocate for the men and women who work in this sector and for the economic growth it brings and for the help it brings to families and the good jobs it brings. So, Madam President, that's the rationale behind my vote. You know, right now, I think we're starting to see, whether it's the Keystone Pipeline decision, the men and women in the building trades who have built this country through hard work, they're being laid off by the thousands. We've had a big scare back home in my state. All weekend I was working this issue of these executive orders from the Biden administration where it looked like it was going to send hundreds of people home, unemployed, oil and gas workers in my state. Why? I hope that's not the case, especially during a recession, but we need a debate on it. And I certainly hope somebody in this administration, when their principals meetings, talk about how we get good jobs, strong working class. I've noticed the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, keeps talking about we're going to base our policies on working class families. You can't get more blue-collar, strong, middle class than these energy sector jobs. So I certainly want to have a good, constructive relationship with the Secretary of the Treasury and her team. But given the people I represent and what I'm starting to see right now, I could not in good conscience vote yes when the basic question of, are you committed and will be a strong advocate for a strong energy sector? All of the above, you name it, renewables, natural gas, wind, solar, all the above. And because I couldn't get that commitment, I reluctantly voted no on someone who's got a background and experience in these other areas that's important for the country. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Madam President, I have hastened to the floor because I was upstairs waiting for the House managers to bring the articles over, and I heard my friend, the distinguished senator from Alaska, talking about his concern about the fossil fuel part of the energy sector and his dissatisfaction with what the Secretary of the Treasury was able to assure him in that regard. And I just wanted to note that I missed a moment of the senator's remarks when I came walking down here. But as best I could tell, the senator never mentioned the term climate change, never referenced carbon emissions. And I have to say, if we're going to deal with our energy sector, we have to deal with it in a way that takes into account carbon emissions and climate change. You can't just whistle past those things, Madam President, and pretend that they're not real, and act as if we can continue to go forward the way we always have, releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, poisoning our oceans with acidification, warming the planet, putting coastal communities like mine at grave risk from sea level rise and storm surge. We have to address those things. And as we go forward in this new Congress, I very much hope that my friend Senator Sullivan and I will be able to work together to address that exact problem, to make sure that not only is our energy mix strong for our economy, but to make absolutely sure that we are not sacrificing the safety of our planet, the economic security of our future generations, the health of people all around the planet who have really no choice but to live close to the land and feel the pounding of climate change in their immediate lives every day. We have to address those things, and I hope we will. So having heard his side of the argument, I just wanted to come back to the floor and offer the other side. And somewhere between us, there is a resolution, because I know perfectly well that the state of Alaska is getting hit by the acidification and warming side, by the sea level rise and storm surge side of this problem, just as much as Rhode Island is. And perhaps because, as my friend constantly reminds me, Alaska has a huge advantage of size over Rhode Island. One could even imagine that they're having more of an effect than Rhode Island. So with those comments and with affection and regard for my colleague from Alaska, I yield the floor.
The senator from Alaska.
As a lot of our colleagues here know, Senator Whitehouse is not just a distinguished senator, but one of my very good friends here in the U.S. Senate. So I always respect what he has to say, and I appreciate his words. And he and I have done a lot of work, some key work, particularly on issues of the environment, cleaning up our oceans, ocean acidification, and I look forward to continuing to work with him. My point is that, and climate change is certainly happening in my state, we're seeing it, no doubt about it. My point is, when you have an economy that's in recession, and you have tens of thousands, literally hundreds of thousands of people out of work, and you have a sector that's important, critical actually, the energy sector, no doubt about it. I know we can use words like spewing and polluters. The energy sector has been one of the things that has made this country so strong, with great jobs and middle-class jobs, and people can't deny that. And all I'm asking for is the new Secretary of the Treasury has to look at that when we're looking at the whole U.S. economy and the strength of our recovery and good-paying jobs. That has to be taken into account. And what I worry is that it's not, and we need a debate. And I would welcome it with my good friend on what is the strategy. But the strategy out of the box can't be, we're going to go after these oil and gas jobs and put people out of work. and replace it with what? We had a hearing in the Commerce Committee with the new Transportation Secretary, incoming Transportation Secretary. A lot of people ask, well, what are you going to replace it with? What are you telling the 10,000 guys who just lost their job on the Keystone Pipeline what their new job is going to be? They have mortgages. They have tuition to pay. They're out of work right now. So we need a strategy. Look, I look forward to working with all these issues with my good friend from Rhode Island. But it is, I think, a first. If you look back at the great history of this nation, if you don't have a U.S. Treasury Secretary or other members of the cabinet who are for a robust, strong energy sector, which of course would include renewables, that's new, that's different, and I think it's very troubling, particularly as it relates to the jobs that I think are going to be sacrificed on a policy and a strategy that I have not seen the meat and bones of yet. I'm just seeing the damage, and a lot of the damage is starting to happen to people I care about, particularly in my state, who work in these sectors and are great Americans who have helped build this country, built my state, and we can't just disregard them and say, don't worry, you're going to get a green job later. It's tough to tell people that. It's tough to tell people that when they got a mortgage and tuition, and we're relying on that. So I commit to continue to work with these issues and others with my friend from Rhode Island. I appreciate him coming down here, but I wanted to explain my vote on an issue that I think we need to debate here in the Senate that's important for our nation. I yield the floor.
The senator from Rhode Island.
I would just close by suggesting that perhaps my friend, the senator from Alaska, can sympathize, since he fears that the interests that he came to the floor here to defend will not be listened to. Perhaps he can sympathize with the fact that for 4 years, an entire administration wouldn't give the time of day to the sea level rise concerns that are threatening my state. We are talking about Freddie Mac, talking about a property value crash across all of our coasts that's going to cause enormous harm to Rhode Island. And we just left an administration that wouldn't pay one iota of attention to that. They had fossil fuel industry climate deniers, and there is such a thing. Not everybody in the fossil fuel industry is that way, but they picked the bottom feeders to bring into government. So I share the senator's frustration, but let me say I've got it about 10,000 times over after having lived with the Trump administration for the past 4 years and gotten nothing, having tried to bring serious climate debate to the floor and knowing that the Republican leader was going to block it. So yeah, I sympathize with his distress, and I hope he sympathizes with my rather greater cumulative distress from the last 4 years. I yield the floor.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Majority Leader.
The quorum.
I
I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be vitiated.
without objection. For the rest, the hour of 7 p.m. having arrived, the acting Sergeant at Arms will present the managers on the part of the House of Representatives.
Mr. President and members of the Senate, I announce the presence of the managers on the part of the House of Representatives to conduct proceedings on behalf of the House concerning the impeachment of Donald John Trump, former President of the United States.
The managers on the part of the House will be received and escorted to the well of the Senate. Sergeant at Arms will make the proclamation.
Hear ye, hear ye, hear ye. All persons are commanded to keep silent on pain of imprisonment while the House of Representatives is exhibiting to the Senate of the United States an article of impeachment against Donald John Trump, former President of the United States.
The managers on the part of the House will proceed.
Mr. President, the managers on the part of the House of Representatives are here and present and ready to present the article of impeachment which has been preferred by the House of Representatives against Donald John Trump, former President of the United States. The House adopted the following resolution, which with the permission of the Senate, I will read. House Resolution 40 in the House of Representatives, United States, January 13th, 2021, resolved that Mr. Raskin, Ms. DeGette, Mr. Cicilline, Mr. Castro of Texas, Mr. Swalwell, Mr. Liu, Ms. Plaskett, Mr. Neguse, and Ms. Dean are appointed managers to conduct the impeachment trial against Donald John Trump, President of the United States, that a message be sent to the Senate to inform the Senate of the appointments, and that the manager so appointed may, in connection with the preparation and the conduct of the trial, exhibit the article of impeachment to the Senate and take all other actions necessary, which may include the following: employing legal, clerical, and other necessary assistance, and incurring such other expenses as may be necessary to be paid from amounts available to the Committee on the Judiciary under applicable expense resolutions or from the applicable accounts of the House of Representatives. 2, sending for persons and papers and filing with the Secretary of the Senate on the part of the House of Representatives any pleadings in conjunction with or subsequent to the exhibition of the articles of impeachment that the managers consider necessary. Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House of Representatives. With the permission of the Senate, I will now read the article of impeachment. House Resolution 24 in the House of Representatives, United States, January 13th, 2021. Resolved that Donald John Trump, President of the United States, is impeached for high crimes and misdemeanors, and that the following article of impeachment be exhibited to the United States Senate. Article of impeachment exhibited by the House of Representatives of the United States of America in the name of itself and of the people of the United States of America against Donald John Trump, President of the United States of America, in maintenance and support of its impeachment against him for high crimes and misdemeanors. Article 1, incitement of insurrection. The Constitution provides that the House of Representatives shall have the sole power of impeachment, and the President shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Further, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution prohibits any person who has, quote, engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the United States from holding any office under the United States, unquote. In his conduct while President of the United States and in violation of his constitutional oath faithfully to execute the office of the President of the United States and to the best of his ability preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, and in violation of his constitutional duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, Donald John Trump engaged in high crimes and misdemeanors by inciting violence against the government of the United States. In that, on January 6, 2021, pursuant to the 12th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, the Vice President of the United States, the House of Representatives, and the Senate met at the United States Capitol for a joint session of Congress to count the votes of the Electoral College. In the months preceding the joint session, President Trump repeatedly issued false statements asserting that the presidential election results were the product of widespread fraud and should not be accepted by the American people or certified by state or federal officials. Shortly before the joint session commenced, President Trump addressed a crowd at the Ellipse in Washington, D.C. There, he reiterated false claims that we won this election and we won it by a landslide. He also willfully made statements that in context encouraged and foreseeably resulted in lawless action at the Capitol, such as, if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. Thus incited by President Trump, members of the crowd he had addressed in an attempt to, among other objectives, interfere with the joint session's solemn constitutional duty to certify the results of the 2020 presidential election, unlawfully breached and vandalized the Capitol, injured and killed law enforcement personnel, menaced members of Congress, the Vice President, and congressional personnel, and engaged in other violent, deadly, destructive, and seditious acts. President Trump's conduct on January 6, 2021 followed his prior efforts to subvert and obstruct the certification of the results of the 2020 presidential election. Those prior efforts included a phone call on January 2nd, 2021, during which President Trump urged the Secretary of State of Georgia, Brad Raffensperger, to, quote, find enough votes to overturn the Georgia presidential election results, and threatened Secretary Raffensperger if he failed to do so. In all this, President Trump gravely endangered the security of the United States and its institutions of government. He threatened the integrity of the democratic system, interfered with the peaceful transition of power, and imperiled a co-equal branch of government. He thereby betrayed his trust as president to the manifest injury of the people of the United States. Wherefore, Donald John Trump, by such conduct, has demonstrated that he will remain a threat to national security, democracy, and the Constitution if allowed to remain in office, and has acted in a manner grossly incompatible with self-governance and the rule of law. Donald John Trump thus warrants impeachment and trial, removal from office, and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States. Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House of Representatives. Mr. President, that completes the exhibition of the article of impeachment against Donald John Trump, President of the United States. The managers request that the Senate take order for the trial. The managers now request leave to withdraw.
Thank you, Mr. Raskin. And the Senate will duly notify the House of Representatives when it is ready to proceed with the trial. Thank you.
Mr. President,
the Majority Leader.
I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.